For nearly a century, humanity stood at the center of galactic politics, not as conquerors, but as mediators. While dominant species expanded through fear and overwhelming force, humans built their influence differently. They negotiated ceasefires, resolved territorial disputes, and absorbed provocations that would have triggered wars if committed against anyone else. Their fleets remained modest, their tone measured, their decisions predictable. To the wider galaxy, humanity became something convenient, reliable, reasonable, and ultimately harmless. That perception slowly turned into exploitation. Trade agreements began to tilt unfairly. Shipping lanes were redirected at humanity's expense. Outer colonies reported increasing pressure from neighboring powers testing boundaries, probing for reactions. Each time, humanity responded the same way: formal protests, diplomatic talks, peaceful resolutions. No escalation. No retaliation. Just patience. Over time, that patience was misunderstood. To rising empires eager to assert dominance, humanity didn't look disciplined. It looked weak. A species unwilling to defend itself. A civilization that could be pushed without consequence. Then came the decision that would change everything. A distant human colony, small and far from core systems, was selected as a message. There was no warning, no declaration of conflict. The strike came suddenly, overwhelming orbital bombardment followed by systematic eradication. Cities disappeared in minutes. Infrastructure collapsed into silence. Billions were gone before any signal could reach beyond the system. When it was over, a single transmission echoed across the networks. A justification. Cold. Precise. Framing the destruction as a necessary act to maintain order, a demonstration meant to remind humanity of its place. The galaxy reacted exactly as expected. Shock followed by speculation. Some condemned the act, others quietly approved, seeing it as a practical move to stabilize power dynamics. But across every system, one assumption remained constant. Humanity would respond with words. Emergency councils would be called. Delegations would demand accountability. There would be outrage, but controlled, measured, contained within the familiar boundaries of diplomacy. Because that's what humanity had always done. But this time, the response never came. No summons for negotiation. No public address. No visible mobilization. Human space went silent. At first, it was dismissed as shock. Then as internal division. Analysts predicted delays, expecting eventual dialogue once humanity gathered itself. But days passed, and nothing changed. Weeks followed, and still there was no statement, no demand, no visible reaction. Only absence. Trade routes leading into human territory were quietly closed. Diplomatic envoys found themselves unanswered. Monitoring stations detected movement, but nothing that fit known patterns. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't panic. It was controlled. For the first time in recorded history, humanity was not explaining itself. And that silence began to spread something unfamiliar across the galaxy. Uncertainty. Because beneath that silence, something had shifted, and no one could yet see what it was. Days stretched into weeks, and the silence did not break, it deepened. Human representatives vanished entirely from interstellar councils. Long-standing diplomatic channels returned nothing but automated acknowledgments. Even minor communications, routine, procedural, expected, ceased without explanation. It wasn't disorder. It was deliberate withdrawal. Across the galaxy, interpretations fractured. Some believed humanity had been paralyzed by the scale of loss. Others assumed political infighting, expecting factions to emerge and eventually push for negotiation. A few dismissed the silence altogether, convinced it was nothing more than a delayed reaction from a species known for hesitation. None of them understood what was actually happening. Humanity was not reacting. It was preparing. Deep within their systems, changes unfolded with precision that had clearly been planned long before the colony's destruction. Fleets once labeled symbolic, kept small to maintain the image of neutrality, were recalled and reorganized. Shipyards that had operated at steady, predictable outputs shifted overnight into relentless production cycles. Civilian industries converted without resistance, following protocols that had existed quietly, unused, for decades. Nothing was improvised. Everything was ready. Hidden infrastructure, dismissed by outsiders as outdated or irrelevant, activated in perfect synchronization. Listening posts expanded into command nodes. Research facilities transitioned into strategic hubs. Supply chains rerouted with efficiency that suggested rehearsal, not reaction. And beneath it all, information began to move. For generations, humanity had observed. Every conflict, every alliance, every tactical doctrine used by other species had been studied, recorded, and understood. Weaknesses were identified, not to exploit, but to avoid escalation. That restraint had created an illusion that those weaknesses didn't matter. Now they did. Quietly, systematically, human intelligence networks resurfaced across the galaxy. Embedded observers, long inactive, began transmitting. Strategic maps were updated in real time. Defense grids, fleet patterns, command hierarchies, nothing was unknown anymore. Still, there was no announcement. No warning. No visible threat. And that absence became the most dangerous signal of all. Because while the galaxy waited for humanity to speak, it failed to realize something far more critical had already happened. Humanity had stopped trying to be understood. And started deciding. It didn't begin with a declaration. There was no build-up, no final warning to mark the shift from silence to action. One moment the galaxy was watching, waiting for humanity to speak, and the next, it was already happening. Across multiple systems, at the exact same second, human forces engaged. Command centers were the first to disappear. Not damaged, not disabled, gone. Precision strikes eliminated leadership nodes before any coordinated response could form. Fleets stationed at defensive perimeters attempted to mobilize, but their communication networks collapsed instantly, fragmented by disruptions that seemed to originate from within their own systems. Nothing was random. Every move had been calculated long in advance. Defense grids that had never failed were bypassed as if their architecture had been designed by human engineers themselves. Strategic outposts went dark one after another, not through prolonged assault, but through targeted eliminations that removed their ability to function at all. Entire armadas found themselves isolated, unable to receive orders, surrounded by forces that had already predicted their every reaction. There was no time to adapt. The empire responsible for the colony's destruction attempted to regroup, issuing emergency commands across what remained of its network. But those commands never reached their destinations. Relay points had already been neutralized. Backup systems were compromised before activation. Leadership chains fractured within minutes, leaving fleets directionless in the middle of an attack they could neither understand nor counter. What followed was not a war. It was dismantling. Human forces moved with controlled efficiency, eliminating only what was necessary to collapse resistance. Key military assets were removed. Strategic infrastructure was disabled with minimal collateral damage. Civilian zones were left untouched, not out of hesitation, but by design. That precision made it worse. Because it proved this wasn't rage without control. It was fury refined into something far more dangerous, something that chose exactly where to strike and exactly where to stop. For the rest of the galaxy, the realization came too late. Humanity had not lashed out blindly. It had executed a decision. And there was nothing left to interrupt it. And then, just as precisely as it began, it ended. No prolonged offensives. No expansion into undefended systems. Human fleets disengaged and withdrew to the edges of their territory as if a switch had been flipped. The same networks that had gone silent reactivated, but this time they carried a single, unified message. Humanity was ready to speak. There was no anger in the transmission. No threats, no declarations of dominance. Just terms, clear, direct, and non-negotiable. The empire responsible for the colony's destruction no longer existed in any meaningful form. Its leadership had been removed, its command structure erased, its military capacity reduced to fragments incapable of coordination. It was not occupied. It was not annexed. It was simply ended as a threat. Other powers didn't wait for clarification. Systems that had once pressured human borders moved immediately to comply with revised agreements. Trade routes were restored under new conditions, fair ones this time. Military posturing near human space vanished without discussion. No one tested limits anymore. Because they understood. This wasn't conquest. It was correction. Humanity had not claimed territory or demanded tribute. It had drawn a line, one that had always been there, just never enforced. And now that it had been crossed, the response had been absolute. What lingered wasn't just fear. It was clarity. For generations, the galaxy had defined humanity by what it refused to do, refused to escalate, refused to retaliate, refused to dominate. That definition collapsed in a single day. In its place stood something far more difficult to ignore. A species that could choose restraint, and just as easily abandon it. Recovery began. Systems rebuilt. Trade resumed. On the surface, balance returned. But memory doesn't reset. Every empire, every fleet, every leader carried the same understanding forward. Not as speculation, not as theory, but as fact proven beyond doubt. Humanity's patience was never infinite. Its restraint was never weakness. And the moment it decided otherwise, the outcome was never in question. That was the lesson. The one no species would ever forget.